Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be looking at key concepts and terminology in genetics. Genetics is the study of genes, heredity, and genetic variation in organisms. To understand genetics, we need to know the basic terminology. So let's get started. First, we have gene. A gene is the basic units of heredity. Genes are specific sequences of DNA that contain the instructions for making proteins. These proteins then determine the traits of an organism. For example, a gene may code for a protein that affects height in pea plants. This could be an allele for tallness or an allele for shortness. And you can see the term allele here. An allele is one of several alternative forms of a gene. For example, if we use T for the allele for tall plants, and T for the allele for short plants, then a plant may have two alleles, TT or TT or TT. The important thing to remember here is that each individual has two alleles for each gene, one inherited from each parent. Okay, so we have gene and allele. Where do these genes and alleles reside? Well, they reside at a locus. A locus is simply the location of a gene on a chromosome. Remember that chromosomes carry genetic information in the form of genes. In humans, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes, one set from each parent. Each chromosome contains many genes. Let's take a look at the genotype and phenotype. You may have guessed it from earlier examples, but the genotype is the genetic makeup of an individual. For example, if we use T and T to represent the alleles for plant height, then the genotype of a plant could be TT, TT, or TT. Notice that we are using letters to represent the genotype. We don't actually need to know the actual genetic makeup, but we just need to know how many copies of each allele an individual has. For example, with the plant height allele, if the plant has two T's in its genotype, then it will be homozygous dominant. If it has two T's, then it will be homozygous recessive. And if it has one of each, then it will be heterozygous. Okay, so we have genotypes, but what about the observable characteristics of an individual? Well, that's where we look at the phenotype. The phenotype is the physical expression of a genotype. For example, if T represents the dominant allele for tall plants and T represents the recessive allele for short plants, then a plant with the genotype TT or TT will be tall, while a plant with the genotype TT will be short. Another important distinction is between a dominant allele and a recessive allele. If a dominant allele is present, then it will be expressed. In our earlier example, T was the dominant allele. This means that if an individual has one dominant allele, then they will express that trait. However, if the individual has two recessive alleles, then the recessive trait will be expressed. In our example, this would only be the case if the individual had two lowercase t's in their genotype. Now let's look at this Punnett square. A Punnett square is a diagram used to predict the genotypes and phenotypes of offspring from two parents. Let's say we have two heterozygous parents for plant height, TTXTT. We can use a Punnett square to predict the possible genotypes and phenotypes of their offspring. As you can see, 25% of the offspring are expected to be homozygous dominant TT, 50% are expected to be heterozygous TT, and 25% are expected to be homozygous recessive TT. Therefore, we would expect the phenotypic ratio to be 3 tall plants to 1 short plant. Finally, we have DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the molecule that carries genetic information. DNA is found in the nucleus of cells, and it is responsible for all the traits that are passed down from parents to offspring. A gene is a segment of DNA that contains the instructions for making a protein. Proteins are the molecules that carry out many of the functions in the body. So ultimately, genes are responsible for all the traits of an organism by controlling the production of proteins. However, sometimes there can be changes in the DNA sequence, and these changes can have an effect on the traits of an organism. These changes are called mutations. For example, a mutation may change the DNA sequence in a gene, which may result in a different amino acid being added to a protein. This can lead to a change in the function of the protein and potentially a change in the trait of the organism. So there you have it, some basic genetics terminology. Hopefully this helps you get started with genetics. If you want more videos like this, please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.